Oh my God.
No trouble.
So, I'm Heidi Buno, and I am here to introduce our speaker for tonight. We're very excited to have Robert Thomsen with us. And as most of you know, he is a hairstylist in his full-time job, and he's also our choir director. He's been our choir director since 2022. Is that right? And part of our choir since 2018. So we're very excited to have him here. I would like to also mention for folks who are not, familiar with our church, we have restrooms here. We also have restrooms at the front of the building. And thank you for coming, and let the man speak. Thank you.
Welcome, thank you. As I mentioned, my name is Robert, many of you know me. So as I thought about, putting together this talk for tonight, and as I've done research over the last few weeks, diving into the archives room and, looking at lots of old photos and listening to old recordings, and it dawned on me that this is, considering half of my audience here tonight, this is the literal definition of preaching to the choir. So, many of you are going to, thank you, this is a right? So, many of you are going to see faces you recognize, memories are going to come to mind, so please save those for the end, and I want you to, file those away, and I hope this can bring back some good stuff. So, also, I'm a new kid on the block, right? I've only been here for a few years, so I'm trying to think about, okay, what am I going to talk about? I'm going to stand up here and talk for an hour about a history that I was not really a part of for a long time. There are people here in the room who have been part of that history for a long time. So I thought, all right, well, I can talk about, what happened here in the church, but also how did we get here? How do we, formulate what we sing every week? Like, where did all this stuff come from? So in my deep dive, I thought, all right, I'm just going to go back to the beginning, right? So, Psalms, they talk about, singing and praising, for many passages speak about the importance of music and worship. So, for instance, Psalm 95, verses 1 and 2. Come, let us sing for the joy of the Lord. Let us shout aloud to the rock of our salvation. Let us come before him with thanksgiving and extol him with music and song. So this, of course, encourages us to express joy and gratitude, right, through music. Different instruments that are referred to in the Bible. We've got the harp, this is a common instrument in ancient Israel. King David was known for his skill playing the harp. Also, he would play for King Saul, right? And the quote from the book of Samuel is that whenever the Spirit from God would come on Saul, David would take up his lyre and play. Then relief would come to Saul. He would feel better, and the evil spirit would leave him, right? So that's what we do every week, right? Get the evil spirits out, right? So he also established a group of musicians whose primary duty was to perform music in the temple. So that was also seen as a way of bringing the worshipers in closer communion with God. Then other instruments that were used were the trumpet, the flute, the cymbals. In Psalm 150, we read praise him, the clash of cymbals. And just a few examples of, since biblical times, of musical instruments that have been used during worship, and a very important part of cultural life in ancient Israel, and they continue to be part of our expression today. So, as we move into the New Testament, Apostle Paul talks about the use of music in worship. Colossians 3, chapter 3, verse 16. Let the message of Christ dwell among you richly as you teach and admonish one another with all wisdom through psalms, hymns, and songs from the Spirit, singing to God with gratitude in your hearts, right? So from the beginning of all of this, music and singing has been a part of it. So now, the only record of communal song that we find in the Bible, or in the Gospels, is the last meeting of the disciples. So before they, go out, when they had sung a hymn, they went out into the Mount of Olives right before the crucifixion. So it's interesting that it's talked about so many times in practice, and yet in the Gospels, it's just this one instance of communal song when they got together and sang. So now, as we move forward, beyond, crucifixion and other instances of what we call antiphony. So antiphony is a Greek for opposite and voice. So Socrates wrote that antiphony was introduced by Ignatius of Antioch, who's there on the right, after he saw a vision of two choirs of angels. So when we think about the origins of how we would sing psalms, it was antiphonally, right? So opposite in voice, so alternating groups of performers, like he saw in his vision, two choirs of angels. And there's also a reference to singing antiphons from ancient Greek times. Pliny the Younger, who actually was the first person who documented the explosion of Mount Vesuvius in 25 AD, he actually wrote to the Emperor Trajan saying that he was asking for help and describing the practice of these Christians who were gathering before sunrise and repeating antiphonally a hymn to Christ as to God. So even from the very, very beginning, Christians were singing these antiphons back and forth, and then persecuted for it, right? So then as we move into, the psalmody of ancient Jewish practices, they very much contributed to Christian chant, and the synagogue tradition, the structure of the services of the ancient Israelites, they were all incorporated into the early Christian tradition. So the carrying on the practice, the services at fixed hours, all our canonical hours that have been formed by the original Hebrew practices, they all began to evolve. So for example, this is an image or a model of the temple in Jerusalem. So the Kedusha, which is used still today in Jewish prayer, it's several prayers that are recited during Jewish services. They have in common 3 biblical verses, which are going to be kind of interesting, because I think you'll notice some of these. So this. This is like we're teaching you Russian, right? And the choir learn Russian, you're going to learn Hebrew tonight, right? Kadosh, 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 Adonai, Tzvabayot, Malok, Halok, Haaretz, Kodo. Anybody, right? Anybody? Holy, 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 the Lord of hosts, the entire world is filled with his glory, right? Stuff we still sing today, right? And then the second one, Ezekiel 3:12, Baruch haba Adonai b'mkomo. Blessed is the glory of the Lord from his place. Again, still in practice today, right? So from the origins of these Hebrew practices, we still are saying these things in service today. Yimloch Adonai l'olam Elohei Sayom Daror Baror Hallelujah. Okay. You got that one, right? The Lord shall reign forever, your God, O Zion, from generation to generation. Hallelujah. So still, today, all these things are used in our worship music, right? Now, things began to change. During the first century, there actually became a strong aversion to instrumental use in worship because certain groups among the Jewish and the Christian people, they associated instruments with pagan rituals. Also, the Jewish people, they felt as though it was associated with the Jewish temple. So this is an artist's rendering of the temple being destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. So once that happened, they stopped using instruments because they associated it with the loss of their temple. And early Christians also believed that words should be sung rather than used with a musical accompaniment. So as the Roman Empire grew in the first 2 or 3 centuries, all these Christian music practices, they started to absorb the different influences from Greek music and all these other cultures bordering on the Mediterranean. So from Jerusalem to Asia Minor to North Africa and Europe, all these influences started to become part of worship music and plain chant. And the monasteries and churches of Syria, it's interesting, they were actually important in the development of what we call strophic devotional song, which is repeating the same structure with all verses sung to the same music. And what's that we sing today? Hymns, exactly, right. So it did not really become part of the Latin church practice until about 2 centuries later when the plain chant traditions began to be formulated. So Bishop Ambrose of Milan, he's credited with introducing hymnody to the Western church. His differed because he started to freely compose rather than specifically using psalms as the lyrics. So one of his original compositions, which is Come Thou Redeemer of the Earth, which you would actually probably be pretty familiar with. It's a little off track because they are using a violin in this recording, but so that's when plain chant and vocals were the only source of worship music. And then as we moved into the 4th and 5th centuries, St. Augustine, who was actually one of the more influential figures in helping encourage instruments to be part of worship music again, he was considering St. Ambrose his mentor, who wrote this previous hymn, and he actually was baptized by him. He believed instrumental music would be distracting. However, he said, or wrote, I am inclined to approve the use of musical instruments in church, that they may assist the people in praising God with cheerful and tuneful hearts, but let them be subordinate to the voice and never allowed to drown it. So this is where responsorial psalms came into play. They were introduced in the 5th century, where a psalm verse was sung by the people, and between verses sung by the cantor. Over time, this practice kind of diminished, like his vision from earlier, the psalms would be sung by 2 choirs alternating verses, the antiphonal psalmody. So evidence of musical roles through the 6th and 7th century, they become spotty because of the cycle of invasions of Germanic tribes in the West, doctrinal political conflict in the East, and instability of Christian institutions. So we move forward now to the origins of Gregorian chant, and this is what you are seeing on the screen right there. This is when the development of music notation was formed. This is around 900 AD. And of course, stage lines still performed in Latin today, usually sung by male choirs in monasteries and churches. Now, this was named after Pope Gregory I, who was in that picture there on the right. He is the patron saint of musicians, singers, students, and teachers. So, it's my guy right there. It's unlikely that he actually was directly involved, but they considered him a building pope. So what he did was he helped establish more order in the liturgy, and then what we really come to know as Gregorian chant today, it was developed several generations after St. Gregory's death, and in fact, they think it's St. Gregory, Pope Gregory II, who reigned about 100 years later, that he actually had more of a hand in formulating the body of chants that we know today as Gregorian chant. So now we move into the structure. The Gregorian chants were actually split to be two different uses, and this is typically in the Catholic and Anglican and Lutheran liturgies. But most masses are settings in Latin. There are a significant number that are written in the languages of all the different non-Catholic countries, because where the worship, is being held, the native tongue was much more, accessible for people to practice. So, for example, there are many masses, they call them communion services for the Church of England, but at the time when Christianity was competing with all these other religions for a place at the table, the music and chants were beautiful and trying to attract new members of the church. They were elaborate, really well written. So you had the two different chants introduced. You had the ordinary chants, which the basic text is the same regardless of the season. So the Kyrie eleison, the Gloria, the Credo, Sanctus, and Benedictus, and Agnus Dei. And then you have the proper chants, which are where the text changed according to the liturgical occasion. So on top of the proper chants and the ordinary chants, we also have the Requiem Mass, which then consequently many composers added their flavor to different Requiem Masses. Bach, Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, and many along the way. Now, the next form of music that came along, carols, and we use those in worship, particularly around Christmas time, but they were generally religious songs at the beginning, not necessarily connected with church worship, but they were Christmas, Advent, and also Easter carols that are a little lesser known. Traditionally, they've been based on medieval chord progressions. Some can be traced back to the Middle Ages, and they made carols some of the oldest musical compositions that we are still sing today, one of which, actually, and so here, you'll hear at the end of this is the piece I played before, you start to hear parallel harmony. This is what they call parallel organum. This is where they started to add more, what we refer to today as polyphony, added in different parts. It wasn't just fourths and fifths, it started to get more and more interesting. But this is one singer on the melody and someone else at a constant fourth or fifth. And as we move into the next, one of the oldest carols that we still know today, Aurelius Clemens Prudentius, who's in the middle there. This hymn was based on the Latin poem that he wrote from as early as the 10th century. You still know this, it's still singing today, right? So from the 10th century, this has stood true. So they were originally, communal songs used during harvest time and the Christmas celebrations. And then as we moved into the 9th and 10th centuries, the Christmas sequence was introduced in Northern Europe, European monasteries, developing under Bernard of Clairvaux, who's here on the right. My right, your left. He was an abbot, mystic, and consequently co-founder of the Knights Templar. He was the one who formed a sequence of rhymed stanzas, and then in the 12th century, a Parisian monk began to derive music from popular songs, making them something closer to the Christmas carol we know today. So they gained in popularity as the Reformation, occurred in countries, where Protestant churches started to gain ground. And then Martin Luther came along, and he actually also authored carols and encouraged their use in worship. So consequently, the fact that the Lutheran Reformation, they welcomed music, as we know Methodists do. And during the years that the Puritan ban on Christmas was in place in England, many religious services were held in secret. People continued to sing these carols behind closed doors. So now we get to this guy, Martin Luther. He was the one who nailed the 95 Theses to the door of the All Saints Church in October 1517. Not only was he a theologian, but he was also a musician, greatly influenced development of early worship music. He wrote his first hymnal in 1524, and the key feature of Lutheran song was that it was to be sung in the language of the people, so his was in German. But he also believed that music should be used to teach the faith. He created a whole system of singing schools where the children were taught how to sing hymns and psalms. He also advocated for the use of instruments in worship, and as you see in the quote there, he believed that I have no use for cranks who despise music because it is a gift of God. Music drives away the devil.